Hello, Mark here. Before we begin today's episode, I would just like to quickly take the time to ask all of those who are enjoying the series a favour. If the platform you use to listen to Castings for Ancient Greece has a rating or review system, I would be extremely grateful if you would consider leaving the series a quick review. These ratings and reviews go a long way into helping others discover the show, in turn helping it grow. So if you enjoy the series and can spare a few minutes, I would love to read what you have to say about your experiences with the show. Thanks everyone for your support, and let's get to today's episode. Hello everyone, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece for another interview episode, this time with Dr Owen Rees, with the Athenian experience of war. Dr Owen Rees is an associate lecturer in ancient history at Manchester Metropolitan University, where he specialises in the transition of soldiers from civilian life to the battlefield and back again. His books on the topic of ancient Greek warfare include Battles of the Classical Greek World, Pen and Sword 2016, Great Naval Battles of the Ancient Greek World, Pen and Sword 2018, and Military Departures, Homecomings and Death in Classical Athens, Hoplite Transitions, Bloomsbury Academic 2022. He is also the founder and lead editor of the website badancient.com, which brings together a growing network of specialists to fact-check common claims made about the ancient world and expose the prevalent pseudo-history in the modern day. In this episode, I sit down with Dr Owen Rees to focus on his newest scholarly work, Military Departures, Homecomings and Death in Classical Athens. Although we are looking at the Athenian experience of war in the classical age, the unfolding events of particular battles will not be our focus here. Rather, we'll be looking to the often overlooked elements surrounding the campaigns that would be embarked on. We will be more concerned with the experiences around preparing to leave for war, in what would form departure scenes, this looking different to the various parts of society. This will also see us turning to the aftermath of war or campaigns, and how the homecoming was also experienced by these elements of society. With war also comes death, and Dr Rees will also take us through how the Athenian war dead were treated, where they would receive their own form of homecoming. We also look to how the individual hoplites' experience of war may affect them through trauma, or more commonly known to us today as PTSD. We view this topic through the competing theories that ask whether ancient soldiers also suffered this disorder, as soldiers do today. Though, to begin our talk, I spent a little time getting to know Dr Rees, his background and motivations, before we then engage in a little general historical conversation. After this, we then draw our focus to the main subject for our talk, and spend well over an hour looking at the research behind military departures, homecomings and death in classical Athens. Anyway, enough from me, and let's get to hearing from Dr Owen Rees. Well, thank you, Owen, for coming on the show and talking with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
No worries. Well, I thought before we dive into our main part of our talk today, could you give us a bit of a background of yourself and your sort of role in the world of history?
Yeah, of course. So I am an ancient historian. I specialise in classical Greek history mainly, but ultimately I work on the ancient world as a whole. I am not just an academic. I do work at the university, Manchester Metropolitan University at the moment. Next year I take up a postdoctoral position at the University of Nottingham. But also I've spent many years as a freelance history writer, written for various magazines and the like, on ancient and medieval history, actually. Mostly military history. That's kind of my love, my background. But social history is sort of my specialism, shall we say. Yeah. Aside from that, I run the fact-checking website online, badancient.com, where we take queries from the public on sort of common claims about the ancient world, and people just wondering, is there any truth to it? Is there any validity to it at all? So, we'll look at things like, do we actually know how the pyramids are built? What do the archaeologists tell us? is it true the Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa and things like that, which is a real pet project of mine that I love. Other than that, we're talking about today the academic book I've just done, and I'm working on a new public history book, a trade book on sort of a global ancient history. So it's looking at the ancient world from the perspective of living on the periphery of it. So rather than the kind of classic books where you look at life in Rome and life in Athens and the kind of centers and hubs of culture and society, I'm quite interested in what it's like to live far away from that, especially if you're from that society. So, what's it like to be a Greek in Olbia, just outside of Crimea, so far away from Ionia and Athens and mainland Greece, places like that. What's it like being a Roman stuck on Hadrian's Wall in the north of England? And those kind of sort of unusual narratives of the ancient world. That's another real strong interest of mine as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess I did a similar concept, probably not nowhere near as in depth as what you're going to be doing, but I wanted to sort of take my show back a bit and look at the Greek periphery. I'd sort of taken everything up to the end of the Greek and Persian wars and then decided to look at places like Thrace and Macedonia and Sicily and all these other areas that would sort of enter into the Greek world more so, just to give some context to their development and whatnot as well. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what you come up with your work as well.
Yeah, well, it's really fascinating because ultimately it's where the rules and the kind of the stereotypes of these cultures fall apart. So, we have these ideas that, to be, we kind of describe what it is to be a Greek and to live in a Greek polis, a Greek city-state. And ultimately what you're actually describing is either Athens, Thebes, or Sparta. And you're like, well, there's almost 1,000 polis in ancient Greece, and you've described life from 3 of them. So, looking outside of those 3 is always a good starting point. And, the further and further outside of the Greek mainland you go, the better. Because you incorporate more experiences, you incorporate more realities. All of a sudden the idea that, a barbarian is a foreigner who must be kept as far away as possible at spear point. You go to Olbia and all of a sudden he's your next door neighbor who you need to trade with. These boundaries fall apart. The kind of restricted lifestyle of supposedly Greek women not leaving the house just again falls apart when you leave the Greek mainland. Like the evidence just does not suggest that at all. There are other kind of social and cultural underpinnings to our evidence we need to consider, but the easiest way around it is just to look outside the mainland and see what everyone else is up to. So yeah, certainly a worthwhile topic. And when you deal with places like Thrace as well, you really start to merge and blend ideals and ideology. Even for the Greeks, like the Greeks could never really decide. Like the Macedonians, the Greeks could never really decide if the Macedonians were Greek or not. They suddenly become very Greek when Alexander the Great turns up. Let's put it that way. But before then, it's quite a contentious discussion. So yeah, certainly a worthwhile topic.
I must admit, that's one point I've had a little bit of blowback on social media. Every time I talk about Macedon, I get accused of assuming they're not Greek or something when I try and sort of steer away from that subject.
Yeah.
Just because I'm simply not mentioning it.
Yeah, it's really volatile because obviously it also incorporates modern political ideologies as well, ethnic ideologies, modern ethnic ideologies as well. On top of that, I mean, ultimately the idea of being, this isn't today's topic, but ultimately the idea of being Greek isn't set in stone.
Yes.
And I know today we like to talk about ethnicities and we kind of blend it with race even kind of inaccurately. But the idea is that these things are set in stone and they're definable. Go into the ancient world, it's very, very fluid. The common quote comes from Herodotus. It's the idea that it's shared language, shared religion, and shared sort of religious practices. That's rather vague. And how do you deal with Greek dialects that are different? How do you deal with other cultures that maybe don't speak Greek as a first language, but do go to the same temples and do the same rituals? This is where it gets murky, and this is where Macedon in particular becomes very contentious. So yeah, I can understand the blowback. I get it a lot as well.
Yeah, I think a big part of it comes from, I guess, even our concept of what, an ethnic such and such is compared to how the ancients viewed it is very different as well. So that creates a lot of issues when we could be talking about two different things.
Yeah, precisely. You're absolutely right. I mean, ultimately, the line you always need to come back with is most ancient Greeks considered themselves Athenian first or Spartan first, or whatever it is. That's their identity. The fact that they were Greek comes later.
Yeah. All right. I think.
Anyway,
sorry. I was going to say we're probably heading down the road a bit, but
there are more expert people to talk about that for you. I'll tell you that now.
Yeah. So, well, what led you to your interest in the ancient world and medieval world, and I guess coming to the ancient Greek world?
I think the ancient Greek world came to me. It was a love from a very early age through myth. As a young kid, I just read any myth I could find and just swallowed it all up. I absolutely adored it. It was a great escapism, a very vivid world and landscape you kind of were able to enter through these stories. By my teenage years, I rebelled like all teenagers do, and I got really into the Spartans. So that kind of moved me from sort of fiction and basic narrative into sort of more specialist area of ancient Greece, and ultimately that's where it took off. As I went through my university years, that interest kind of evolved and moved away from the Spartans a bit, and that's kind of where we are now. Military history, again, kind of picked up through the Spartans. You're not going to do the Spartans without getting into the wars. However, what I quickly found was that the battle narratives and the wars themselves weren't particularly what interested me. What interested me were the individual stories, the individual relationships going on. And that's kind of what led me out of sort of traditional military history and into what I call a term now, socio-military history. So it's the kind of, I am interested in how society and warfare influence one another and interact with one another, which is what I now get to look at every day, which is great.
It's, I guess, a very similar, or I had a similar sort of path when I first got into history. It was mainly through military history. I'd served in the army here in Australia, and then that sort of piqued my interest in a lot of historical events. And eventually I became dissatisfied with just the military history and wanted to get a bigger picture of what was actually happening amongst these wars and campaigns and whatever else, and try and connect everything together.
Yeah, well, this is it. Military history really opens up a lot of avenues. I mean, ultimately, it is still the most popular form of history in the public market. And that's, academics at the moment are quite down on military history. They consider it quite an old-fashioned way of looking at history. And I guess there's some truth to some of that, but I think that misrepresents what military history has become. For me, military history allows you to stress test a culture and a society. That's what warfare does. It stress tests any society and any society's values. So it's all well and good what, a society says it stands for and says it believes in. If that's never tested, you're never really 100% sure how sturdy those principles are. Put a society in a military conflict and all those ideals get challenged immediately. And then the question is, what stands? And if what stands is what they said they believed in, then you have a strong underpinning to that society. And if you don't, what you have is a fascinating disconnect between belief and action.
Yeah. So now I first came across you fairly early on when I got into the podcasting world, and on social media, you're quite active, and I actually had picked up a couple of your books before I even started the show.
Oh, thanks.
It was the Great Naval Battles of Ancient Greek World and Great Battles of the Classical Greek World. Now, they are directed more towards a casual historian, I guess. Like they're more of a summary approach to a lot of the battles in the ancient Greek world. Now, I was going to sort of get into some of the projects you've got, and we've kind of touched on Bad Ancient and what you've got coming up. But these other works that you've been doing in projects, is it, I guess, an attempt to connect the academic world to the casual history reader as well?
Yeah, that's exactly it. One of my pet peeves as an academic is other academics moaning that the public don't understand about whatever it is they're talking about. And you're like, that's all well and good, but if you're not telling them what the most up-to-date research is telling us, how can they know? The only reason we know is because it's our profession. It's our job to look at this every single day. People don't have that. People want to pick up a book they can trust and they can rely on and read it, not at face value. I do think our readers do scrutinize what they read, but there is an element of trust in what they're reading and trust in the specialism of the person who wrote it. So in that sense, I think it's important to engage with the public with the most up-to-date research you can find. So that's what I tried to achieve with these two books. So they've both been through book reviews of academics. So academics review each other's books and scrutinize them, and hopefully you come out unscathed. When you write a public history book, often you don't. Academics read it as an academic book and find it lacking as a result. Now, fortunately, I didn't end up with reviews like that. But the most common comment I get is there's nothing new here for researchers, but there's nothing quite like this on the market for the public.
Yep.
And that for me is a job of a public historian. Your job isn't to necessarily produce brand new research all the time. Your job is to be that conduit, that kind of link between academia and the public. Because if no one's doing that, how can you expect, interested readers to be up to date with the kind of ideas that are going on? So that's what I tried to do with both of those. Other than that, the other thing I wanted to do was kind of challenge misconceptions, because these two books are about predominantly the Peloponnesian War and the Persian Wars, which have been written about 1 million times. Ultimately, if an interested reader wants to read about the Peloponnesian War, they would just go pick up a book by Donald Kagan. They're easy enough to find, and it's a good narrative overview of it. A little out of date now, but it's the go-to book.
Yep.
So what I wanted to do was to kind of challenge that a little bit, and bring in other elements of battle and warfare that perhaps people don't consider as often. So for ancient Greece, siege warfare is almost considered a non-event. So I tried to bring in a few siege narratives and go, okay, it's not sophisticated. You're not looking at massive siege towers and, sort of siege weapons and things like that. But there are sieges. There is an experience going on here. There are narratives, and these are important. So let's see how the Greeks did actually fight a siege. Originally, the first book was supposed to have a section on naval warfare. But the editor I pitched it to said he wanted it as a whole book, which actually isn't as easy as it sounds, because naval battles don't get a lot of attention, even in the ancient Greek world. Yeah. They're quite short narratives. Yeah. So, again, that's why I wanted to try and produce a whole book for it, to kind of go, look, we can construct some naval battles. Let's have a look at them. Let's see just how varied they are, and let's see just how important they are. Because again, naval warfare, even in modern narratives of the ancient world, are quite dismissive. It's quite dismissed. And it's very much, the ships bring the men and the men fight on land. And that kind of ignores all the important narratives other than Salamis. That's the one that people at least allow a narrative to. So that's kind of the premise of the books. And that's all the public history work I do is precisely for this reason. I want to try and get the public to be allowed to engage with the research that's going on.
Yeah, and it's definitely a good good way to interact with the academic world and the casual historian world. And it's a big reason, I find it important for me to try and connect with people from the academic world as well, where I can bring them on my show and hopefully get their ideas and points of view out there to even more people who obviously have got a big audience of people who dabble in history. And so it's a good way to bring these other topics that they may not come across in popular history books so much as well.
Yeah. Well, this is why I'm a big advocate for podcasts and content. What I deem content producers. So people like yourself, YouTube channels, things like that. I think it's important for academics to engage with them, because ultimately, even if scholars don't, you're still going to produce things. Like that's going to happen because there's a market, and I mean, you've been telling me your podcast has been going 2 years. That's 2 years experience I don't have of, what the market wants, what the listeners want, and what they're interested in. You get requests, you'll get questions from people, and just kind of comments and things like that as an academic, I never see.
Yep.
So sometimes I'm kind of left guessing what people might want to know about. And rather than guess, I'd just rather go to someone who knows, like yourself.
And it's, I guess you're a bit different too, where you've got, obviously you're in the world of academia, producing academic studies and whatnot, but you're also teaching. So you're trying to impart knowledge onto others. And then you're also engaging in these popular history projects as well, where you're engaging just with everyday readers. So it's, I guess, a good way for you to, I guess, get a good broad scope of the I guess the whole world of history as well.
Oh, I hope so. Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. Well, we should probably move on to the main part of our discussion today, and that's
the reason for today.
Yeah, the reason for our chat today. That was the latest book that you've come out with, which was Military Departures, Homecomings, and Death in Classical Athens.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have to say it's probably a topic that we don't tend to find in the forefront of popular histories that are out there. And would this perhaps be one of your motivations to producing a work on this subject?
Yeah, it certainly was. I mean, this book is an academic tome. It was my PhD is what became this book.
Yep.
So it is written entirely from an academic perspective. It's not something I've tried to write to engage with the public. I've written magazine articles and sort of blogs and things off it to try and, disseminate the research I've done. Another reason for doing this podcast. But, first and foremost, it's an academic book and priced as one, I should point out. The reason I did it is because no one's ever talked about it. And I found that really weird. And I don't mean just publicly in sort of popular history. I mean academically. People just don't talk about this. People talk about war. People talk about the experience of combat. People talk about, what motivates the Greeks going to war. People talk about the mobilization process. There's a lot of work on the mobilization process for Athens in particular. And people have, over the past 20 years, started to talk more about the effect of war on the individual after, which is actually how I came into this. I was interested in what's called the PTSD debate in ancient history, which fundamentally, I know we'll probably broach it later, but ultimately comes down to the question of, was there PTSD in the ancient world or not? And that's kind of how I came into it. So I started in that debate. And then I realized that you can't answer that debate until you know how the transitions work, because PTSD is not just, modern PTSD as it's studied, is not just linked to the experiences of war. It's also linked strongly to the experience of homecoming.
Mm-hmm.
So if we don't know how homecoming occurred in the ancient world, we can't answer this question. So that's kind of where I came into it. So I started there. Okay, so how do they actually come home? What happens in that transition? And is there anything that suggests tension or conflict? Something that the classic example in the modern world is the American veterans coming back from the Vietnam War. So Americans coming back from the Vietnam War come back to a society, a culture that actually has almost vilified them for their service. And there's that massive disconnect between what they thought they were doing being right and then society ultimately telling them they didn't agree. So what you have there is a clear example, a very extreme example of tension between civic and military experience and ideals. So that was kind of the starting point. So, when we're discussing something like PTSD in ancient world, is there any evidence of conflict? Is there any evidence of tension between civic and military ideology, behavior, and so on? When that began, like all projects, it then grows. Well, to understand homecoming, you need to understand what happened when they departed. Is there any tension there? Is there any ideology that's being sort of expressed there? Is there any difference between what happens at home to what happens in the army? What happens between politics and domestic ideals? Is there any divergence? Is there any friction? And then finally, if you're going to consider the men departing and that transition, you're then going to consider the men coming home, that homecoming and that transition, there's one other homecoming that needs to be considered in Athens in particular, because Athens is the first state, the first sovereign state in definitely European history, if not world history, to make the decision to repatriate their war dead. No one else does this on a mass scale. You'll get individuals brought home. That happens, especially for the rich and wealthy. But what democratic Athens does in the 5th century is it offers this to every single citizen. If you die in war, we will bring you home.
Yep.
And that is an important shift. Ideologically, it's linked, no doubt, to the democratic ideals of Athens, but it also means that there is another homecoming, the homecoming of the dead. So we need to explore that as well. So that's kind of how the book, as it stands now, kind of organically grew. And I became obsessed with this idea of domestic experience versus military experience. And that's kind of how I split each chapter up, or each 2 chapters. They're in pairs. So it all gets broken up. Okay, so what happens with the family? How are they experiencing this? How is the individual experiencing this? Right. Now, how is the army experiencing this? What happens when he's part of the army? And then through each of the 3 transitions. Yep.
I must admit, the whole subject of PTSD was going to be my next question that I was going to talk to you on, since it's what you opened with in the book anyway. So I thought it'd be a good starting point as well. And I noticed you do present that there are competing views of if PTSD did exist in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Obviously, we know it as PTSD, shell shock back in World War One, and then who knows what the ancients saw it as or recognized it as. What are the competing views when it comes to PTSD in the ancient world?
Okay, so there are basically 2 camps. You have what are called the Universalists. This was started by a psychiatrist of veteran affairs, actually, in the US, a guy called Dr. Jonathan Shea. If you haven't read his book, Achilles in Vietnam, it's a must read. And consider that as I now tell you all the debate and how much I don't necessarily agree with him. It is a must read. It's a fantastic book. And it really blew open this idea that we could look at the experience of the individual in combat in the ancient world. It actually timed in with the so-called face of battle studies, which sort of masterminded by John Keegan many decades ago. That was starting to infiltrate ancient military history around the same time. So whilst we were exploring the kind of the mechanics of not battle, but the mechanics of almost campaigning. So, the kind of view of military campaigns from the perspective of the soldier. So looking at food, looking at provisions, looking at sleep patterns, looking at, tiredness, looking at, how are they getting paid, things like that. Jonathan Shea's work kind of came in as that was really taking off under the work of Victor Davis Hanson in particular. And the sort of movement he was creating in the US. So this kind of came in on that, and it was just an ideal moment. So it took off and exploded. And he did an analysis of the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, and looked at the experience in particular of Achilles through the prism or through the kind of perspective of what he saw in Vietnam veterans in the US. So he actually used the Iliad in, I don't want to say therapy sessions, but sort of group sessions with his veterans, where they would look through bits of the Iliad and talk about Achilles' experiences. The idea being that veterans can often identify themselves in it. And so, this wasn't so much about being historically accurate. It was about helping veterans understand their own experiences today and seeing Achilles as almost a model of that. So he looks at sort of Achilles' berserker state, as he calls it, that kind of madness, that the red mist descending in combat and through rage, the famous opening line of the Iliad, the rage of Achilles. Yeah. And he found it very effective. He then did a follow-up book which looked at the experience of Odysseus coming home. I must admit, this is where he loses me as a model. But, he tried to look at Odysseus' homecoming as almost like an allegory or a metaphor for a veteran's transition home. And looking at things like sex addiction, looking at things like loss of sort of desires of this, that, and the other, looking at alcoholism, looking at, all the many things various veterans that he was working with were experiencing. He then used that as a way of kind of looking at the Odyssey and using the Odyssey to help them navigate their own experiences as well, including relationships with their wives, their families, and things like that. So really important work, really fascinating work, and it created this model that we call universalism. Universalism is basically the idea that humans have always been biologically the same. And whilst there are cultural differences, ultimately our wiring is the same. And because our wiring is the same, we can make certain assumptions about the experience of the human. Okay? So in combat, very simply, combat causes trauma. All combat has been traumatic. Ergo, all combat throughout history has caused trauma.
Yep.
Okay? We know that PTSD has a strong underpinning in the neurology of the brain, to put it simply. Because that neurology hasn't seemingly changed, therefore we can assume that PTSD has always existed. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yep.
Yep. That's the universalist position. So we can just assume that everything stays the same. So when we look at the evidence and we see someone who is a soldier or who is a veteran, who is perhaps very aggressive or very hypervigilant, or it seems to be addicted to warfare in some way, we can immediately go, that looks the same as modern PTSD, so it must be PTSD in the ancient world.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's the universalist position. This was counteracted by what we call the relativist position. Put very simply, all cultures are relative. So actually, we can't ignore the cultural upbringing of an individual that influences the way they experience war, influences the way they understand war. At its most basic level, you can't assume war is traumatic for every single person from every single culture.
Yep.
So if a culture has raised you to love warfare, if a culture has raised you to want to go into battle and want to kill people, we can't assume that you would therefore find the act of killing someone traumatic. This was put forward by a guy called Dr. Jason Crowley. He used sort of the modern American GI, and he contrasted it with the Athenian hoplite.
Yep.
And looked at their two upbringings, but also their military environment, their tactical environment, their strategic environment, things like that, and showed constant contrast. And go, these are not the same. They don't even look the same. They're not interacting with combat the same way. They're not experiencing the act of killing in the same way. They have a different relationship with death. So actually, we can't assume any of this. That's what I call the hardcore, the hard-lined relativist position. He actually goes as far as to say that the Athenian society immunizes the hoplite from PTSD as we know it now.
Okay.
He's basically saying it's impossible.
Yep.
That's a bit much, I'll be honest. I personally, and I say that he was my PhD supervisor. We have a close relationship. That's a bit much. There is a sort of a new wave of looking at it. It's an argument I've put forward. It's an argument a few other academics are beginning to put forward, which is sort of something you intonated in your own way a minute ago, which is, I mean, you said, we call it PTSD. There was shell shock. Before there was sort of battle fatigue, lots of terms, so they may not have called it PTSD in the ancient world, but how did they understand it?
Yep.
You're sort of right with just a little need of a tweak, because what you're looking for, you're still looking for PTSD in the ancient world. What we need to look at is the phenomenon. And the phenomenon is the negative impact on the individual from the experience of war. What we can't assume is that they're negatively impacted by the same things we are. Okay? So we can't assume killing is a traumatic thing to an ancient individual. I'll accept that. I think that's a bit oversimplistic, but I can accept that they might view killing differently to us. Yeah. That doesn't mean they don't find their friend next to them dying traumatic. Yeah, so there's still potential flashpoints of traumatic experience that they'll have. And they'll also have traumatic experiences that the modern soldier might not. So, for instance, the relationship with, I don't know, maybe like the relationship with religious iconography or religious sites.
Yeah.
I'm not saying all soldiers are atheists. Of course they're not. There's a very famous maxim, there are no atheists in the foxhole. However, we have a different relationship with religion. We have a different relationship with different religions nowadays. In the ancient world, they see everything through not a religious prism, but the divine is all around them. So you do wonder, if an individual kills someone in a temple or sacks a temple in some way, how does that affect them psychologically afterwards when they come home and they realize just how wrong that was? So there are other potential flashpoints that we need to consider, and we need to look at it through their eyes. This also means looking at what we might call the symptoms of PTSD or the symptoms of trauma through the eyes of the ancient world as well.
Yep.
The simple example for this is at the Battle of Marathon. So you've got the Athenian and Plataean army at the Battle of Marathon fighting the Persians, and we're told by Herodotus the story of a man called Epizelos. Now, Epizelos is fighting on the front line of the Athenian phalanx, and a giant Persian of a man comes before him, hacks down the man to his left and kills him, passes over Epizelos, and then continues fighting. So he kind of ignores Epizelos and continues fighting. Epizelos sees this happen and is immediately struck blind. And Herodotus is very clear, no weapon touched him, but he loses his sight.
Yep.
Okay. So this is what many scholars call an epiphany. So an epiphany in the ancient world is basically an experience with the divine. Now, when a human experiences some form of interaction with the divine in the ancient Greek world, he is punished because he has transcended what a human is allowed to do. Okay. So Epizelos' punishment for interacting with the divine is his blindness. Now, modern psychiatry, the universalist model of PTSD looks at Epizelos and goes, that is some form of almost what used to be called hysterical blindness. Okay. Yep. So he's gone blind because the mind has shut down. I don't like what I'm seeing. This is traumatic. I don't want to see it anymore. We have similar accounts from the killing fields of Cambodia, for instance, of women losing their sight immediately for no reason. So to that end, there is you can try and explain it through the modern world. But what's more interesting for me is looking at it from the ancient Greek perspective. So you've got this interaction with the divine, and that causes his punishment. That's interesting in its own right. But what's also interesting is when he goes home, when he returns to Athens as a blinded man, he becomes a hero. He becomes famous in Athens. His story is well known. He is renowned. There's a painted mural, the painted stoa in the Agora in the marketplace of Athens, which paints important mythical events from Athenian history. And at the end of it is the Battle of Marathon as well, creating this obvious link. The Battle of Marathon is an extension of this heroic age of Athens. We are told by more than one source that Epizelos is identifiable in that painting. Now, we don't have that painting anymore, but we have descriptions of it, and he is identifiable in it. So what we have is this story of a man who is, to our mind, traumatized, but his trauma causes adoration. It causes, his fame as a result.
Yep.
Now, this allows historians to sort of look at, okay, so there is some form of traumatic experience here, but that doesn't mean that it negatively affects his life when he returns home in the same way PTSD, depression, and so on does for military personnel today. So now we can start to look at actually how does society interact with men who have experienced war in this way.
Yes. You could well perhaps have PTSD occurring, but it's, like you said, different events may cause it. Like what happens today may not be, the same effect on ancient soldiers. Mm-hmm. And then also our ability to even recognize in ancient sources comes down to how societies viewed PTSD as well. It's that's something that actually gets reported. Yeah,
if it gets recorded, and if it gets recorded as a negative thing. This is where ultimately I'm a firm believer that the idea of PTSD in the ancient world has to go. I don't think it fits. PTSD is a set diagnosis, and that diagnosis cannot be used to understand the ancient world at all. There's just not enough evidence.
Yep.
So one of the important things about the PTSD diagnosis is time frame. So, it can't just, these symptoms can't just appear for a couple of weeks and then go. There must be a long period of, months and months and months. There are many timeframes involved. And there is no evidence of that in the ancient world at all, other than this one person being blind.
Yep.
But there's also issues of assuming that what you're being told in the ancient sources is a symptom, and you're being described a symptom. I suppose the best example for this is a Spartan commander by the name of Clearchus. So he's a mercenary commander. He's actually thrown out of Sparta for being too aggressive, basically, which is unexpected, let's be honest. But he's described by Xenophon, who knew him personally, described as Xenophon as a philopolemos, which literally means a war lover. Now, a fantastic ancient historian who is a universalist proponent of PTSD, a guy called Lawrence Tritle, has actually created an argument that Clearchus' story is sort of textbook PTSD. So he goes through the narratives that we have of Clearchus and goes, this is textbook PTSD. And one of the things he really focuses on is this description of philopolemos, this idea that he's a war lover, which he aligns to what we do have described a lot in some veteran experiences, is that kind of addiction to the rush of war, that addiction to adrenaline, and so on. A well-known phenomenon, is a perfectly plausible explanation for why he's been described in this way, Clearchus. The problem is, one, Xenophon doesn't describe it as a bad thing at all. And two, other people are described as war lovers as well. And it's always positive. So it's the idea that they're committed to war. And in the ancient Greek world, that is a good thing, especially for our writers, many of whom are experienced military commanders. Xenophon was a military commander. Thucydides was a military commander. All our writers in the ancient Greek world pretty much were veterans. But Xenophon, Thucydides were not just veterans, they were actually commanders as well. So they have a real appreciation for, shall we say, other elements of the military experience. So the fact that Xenophon is describing him as a war lover is used to just explain why he can't go home and won't go home. He's described as he's a lover of risk as well. So he charges into battle first. He'll lead a few men against hundreds. That's this sort of thing. Tritle basically argues that this shows a sort of a lack of stability in him. But this is where we now have the problem that I mentioned earlier, which is time frame. We don't know how long he was like this. He may have been like this since he was a teenager. We have no idea. So to say that this is proof of PTSD assumes his behavior's changed because of his military experience. So this is where we have to accept the limitations of our evidence, basically. So Clearchus is a fascinating case in his own right. Whether or not it's PTSD is kind of irrelevant. He's an interesting individual, certainly worth looking at anyway.
Yeah. Exhilarated by war.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was just reminding me of, I think it's Ernst Junger. He wrote a book from World War I, and it was basically a celebration of war and how it was the best time of his life. Yeah.
We can't, this is it. Sometimes we have to start to deconstruct our own views of the world and our own views of military experience and our own views of warfare as well before we can look at others. Ultimately, we do look at it as a negative. Like to its most extreme in the UK, for instance, there's a constant kind of friction with our military where they don't really get the kind of recognition that they deserve for the service they do, compared to, say, the US, where it's more sort of ingrained, that kind of respect for veteran status. We don't have that in the same way here, because there is a real kind of disconnect between citizen and soldier here. As well as the politics of warfare and so on. So it is that, we talk about World War I as a horrible event, which of course it was, but that doesn't assume everyone who experienced it would necessarily agree. And we do often have to be cautious of making these assumptions.
Yeah, so I guess it's not so black and white, is there? There's a lot of other elements that come into the mixture to really, and our definitions too could be different to what it could be thousands of years ago as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Spot on.
Have you been enjoying the series and thinking of supporting the show in some way? Casting Through Ancient Greece is over on Patreon, where we have been providing supporters with monthly bonus episodes where we look at past topics in more detail and isolation. So far, we have revisited the Bronze Age of Greece, looking at art, trade connections, warfare, and a number of other topics. We then advanced into the Archaic period, where we spent some time exploring the little-known Lalatine War, the Olympic Games, emergences of the Hoplite, and other areas. This then saw us turn to do a 3-part series on the epic poet Homer, where we also explored the 2 epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that are credited to him. We are now about to embark on exploring topics around the early development of Sparta and Athens, with the return of the Heraclidae being our first area of interest. If you are interested in gaining access to these bonus episodes, please consider heading over to the Casting Through Ancient Greece Patreon page. Not only will you get monthly bonus episodes, but you will receive early access, ad-free episodes, plus monthly video series updates about what has been happening in the series and what is planned. Other options also include fully referenced transcripts of the series episodes, as well as a forum where members' questions are answered every month via video. Alternatively, you can visit the Casting Through Ancient Greece website, where you can find the Patreon link, as well as other ways that help the series grow, when clicking on the Support the Series button. Thank you all for listening to the series, and I look forward to perhaps seeing you over on Patreon.
All right, well, I guess PTSD deals with the act of being in combat and experiencing the war itself, but perhaps we could move on to the preparations for going on campaign or to a war. What did this look like for the individual in Athens?
The individual Athens. So the one of the interesting things about Athens, because Athens is a radical democracy. Okay, so as a radical democracy, all citizens get a say in almost everything.
Yep.
So they get to vote in the assembly, and that includes military expeditions. So Thucydides has quite a few meetings he describes in the Peloponnesian War, specifically to debate whether or not to go to battle, go to war, to go to Mytilene, to cause trouble and things like that. So the individual hoplite who is going on campaign has either voted for it or had the opportunity to vote for it. Okay. So first things first, it shouldn't come as a surprise when he's called up. So Athens has an enlistment system in the 5th century and 4th century. It has an enlistment system. So it's supposed to be fair. It's done by names on a big list, what are called the catalogos, the catalogoi in plural. And these are compiled, brought together, and then the assembly has already said how many men are going to go, how many hoplites are going to go on the expedition, wherever it may be. The most common number is 1,000 men, but it can be anywhere up to sort of 13,000 is the most we hear of an army leaving Athens. So what happens is the votes happens. Everyone knows the expedition is going to occur. You're now waiting to see if your name appears on that list. And it's almost like going back to school and waiting for your grades to be put up on a blackboard, on a pinboard. So, everyone's hovering around in the agora. It all happens centrally in Athens. So if you live outside of Athens, in the sort of suburbs of Attica, shall we say, you've got to come in, or someone from your dean, from your village, will come in to get the names. And, you could sort of envisage the scene of, large crowds in the marketplace waiting for the lists to go up. And then you wait by your tribal statue, basically. Athens is split bureaucratically into 10 tribes. So you're by one of these 10 statues waiting for your tribe's names to go up. And then you get the name. And if your name's on there, you're also told what you need to get. The Athenian military system is an amateur system. Okay, there are no professional soldiers. This is not a professional system at all. And that includes logistically. So when you've got your name, knowing you've got to get ready to go, you've also got to go home, collect your kit, your panoply, so your armor, your weaponry, you've got it yourself. And you also need 3 days rations. That's the other thing you need to take with you. So you've got this sort of basic packing, shall we think of it like that? And then the military narrative is you leave the house, You meet up in the village with the other men who are going up with you. You'll then go as a group to a central mustering point. Now, as I said, Athens does not have a professional system at all. There is not a set mustering point that everyone always goes to every single time. It changes depending on location of where they're going. It depends on why they're being mustered. So, for instance, if they need to go abroad, it makes sense to be mustered nearer the Piraeus, near the port, because you're going to get on a ship. If you're only going to go raid Megara by land, it makes sense to be either mustered outside the city walls or near the city gates, because then you can just leave. However, if you're being mustered, if there's a muster that's been called because of a Spartan invasion or, the Spartan raids from Decelea towards the end of the Peloponnesian War, we see various mustering points throughout Athens. So there's no like central barracks or anything like that you're going to. Okay. So surely the list must also tell you where you need to go. But this is where historians have to kind of piece together a lack of evidence. So that's this kind of military departure at its basic level to the muster. However, in all that, you've got the individual leaving home. And this is what really interested me. And this is something that's never really been looked at properly. Is what does that look like? I mean, it's all well and good saying he leaves the house and does the X, Y, and Z, but what happens when he leaves the house? Does the wife just say goodbye? Does the mum just kiss his head and say see you soon? If he's got children, how are they experiencing this? What about the dad, if there's a dad? What's going on? So what I was particularly interested in is ritual. It's not always easy to get insight into the family dynamic of ancient Greece, any ancient Greek culture. It's very hard to see what's happening inside the house. Yeah. One of the ways we can see it is through religion. So the ancient Athenians are a very religious group of people. Nothing happens without ritual. Nothing happens without ritual. They don't even eat without a ritual involved in some way. Now, this doesn't have to be a massive sort of, pageantry. It can simply be what's called the pouring of a libation, which is at its simplest, pouring a bit of wine on the floor to honor the gods. So it's almost like pouring them a drink with yourself.
Yep.
And it happens every meal. It happens every single time they pretty much do anything. So if someone's leaving for war, rituals must be going on. And actually, we don't see it written in the sources, but we do see it in their artwork, on their vase paintings. You have a very prolific vase painting scene, what's called the military departure scene, the warrior departure scene. And there are thousands of them. So if you've ever been to a museum that has a good collection of Greek vases, chances are you've seen a military departure scene where you often have a man and a woman opposite each other. The man might be holding a jug or a plate, and the woman often holding the other. And that's the pouring of a libation. So you have a warrior in full dress pouring a libation with a woman. And this has always been interpreted as a departure scene. They're preparing to leave. Other sort of versions of this scene show more kind of iconography. So you can see that they're inside the house. You can see that there's a doorway. You can see that there's children around. It's obviously domestic. It's obviously some form of departure. The military dress tells you it's a soldier. It's a military departure scene. It's kind of, what you see is what you get kind of interpretation. So what we then have insight into is how that the choice of ritual being depicted reflects their relationship with the departure itself. All right. Yep. So we can see man departs never alone. So the family is involved. Well, who in the family is depicted? Most often it's a woman. Not always easy to tell if it's the mother or the wife. That's not always easy to spot. But there's almost always a woman. All right. So this is where we can start to build a picture. Actually, the man's not just picking up his armor and leaving. He is there with his family, with his mother, with his wife. We have scenes of the men not only departing with rituals, we also see what's called an arming scene. So the man getting dressed. often with a woman handing him armor, handing him a spear, holding the shield, whatever it be. So what this creates is this impression of actually the family is very involved in this departure. And what we also see in the artwork is that it's a sad event. Okay, so the women and the old men are often shown in a posture of mourning, of sadness and distress. So even though our written evidence doesn't tell us any of this, the artwork really reflects that this is a somber event. So, you know, when we read the kind of the poetry of the classical Greek world, and when we read like the accounts of Thucydides and things like that, and they glorify war, you know, the speech of Pericles at the over the war dead, and you know the great heroism of the war dead, and how great it is that people have died in war. That's a political narrative. In a domestic scene, in a domestic narrative, the family do not agree. This is a very sad event. You know, they hope he comes home. They want him to come home. They don't want him to die. As obvious as that sounds. Yeah. So we can sort of piece together these kind of rituals. We've got these libations. We've got sacrifices being made at home. There's a suggestion there might even have been things like omen reading. You know, so you read the omens with your dad in particular. You might read a liver. You might, what you're looking for is a yes or no answer from the gods. Yep. So basically, will I come back safe? What does the liver say? Yes or no? Mm-hmm. So, you know, this religious interaction, these religious depictions give us greater insight into the kind of emotional experience of these departures. Okay. Yeah. And a little bit about the logistical. Very simply, how does he leave the house? Well, he can't leave the house until he's done his rituals. Then he can leave the house. So he then finally joins the muster. And then, interestingly, at the mustering point, the army goes through the exact same rituals. So the military commander, the strategos, has with him something called a mantis. Now, a mantis is an ancient Greek religious expert. It's often translated as like a seer or an omen reader, but ultimately he does lots of different things, or she. It can be female as well. They do lots of different things. But at this point, what they do is they omen read for the strategos. So they do a sacrifice. They read the omens of the birds, whatever it be that they choose to read. They'll do a reading. And then when the strategos is happy with the omens, they'll leave. What we also see is once the omens are read and are positive, you then have a libation poured. So again, you make an offering to the gods. So you've asked the gods, is this going to be okay? Are we going to come back victorious, safe, whatever it be you ask? We're never told. And then you pour a libation. You make an offering to the gods in advance. There's two reasons why this is particularly interesting. One, that offering to the gods often comes with an oath. So you make a promise. So if we're successful, if I come back alive, I will donate 1/10 of the spoils to you, Athena. You know, something like that. And then obviously you have to do that when you come home. Other reason why this is interesting is because the men in the army are not involved. So the hoplites who have mustered are watching this happen, but they don't take part in it. So it becomes a passive event. So they've gone from a domestic departure in which they're heavily involved in talking to the gods, interacting with the gods, asking for favor with the gods, to a military where they've become one of a mass. What's often called they de-individualized. They've become a group. Yeah, and then it's been done on their behalf. So they've become quite passive, and it kind of creates a sense of unity within the group. You know, you're no longer yourself; you are one of many. And then the strategos, the commander, does things on your behalf as your leader.
Yep.
Okay? So it's a good way of reaffirming hierarchy. It's a good way of reaffirming group identity as well, especially in Athens, which is, as I said, radically democratic, which means actually everyone's equal. And in a military situation, you can't have that. You can't have that everyone's equal. There has to be a hierarchy. So this is a good way of kind of creating that hierarchy, reminding people of that hierarchy as well. So you've had his call up, which can be quite chaotic. We're told there's a funny account in one of Aristophanes' comedies of the day of muster, where a man turns up and finds out he was on the list and no one told him. So he panics and is basically running around trying to get ready to go. So we know it can be a little chaotic. You get your 3 days rations, you go get your kit. How good your kit is depends on how wealthy you are, basically. You go home, you prepare, you say your goodbyes. We also know that you seem to try and set your affairs in order. So you set down what you and I might consider a will and testament.
Yep.
You kind of make your arrangements under the understanding that, this will happen if I don't come home. You have a very emotional departure with your family. We do have the only literary account we have of this moment of departure is a scathing description in a tragedy where a woman is angry at all the mothers that cry when their sons go to war. And it is properly scathing. She does not hold back in how irresponsible and unacceptable this is, that women do this. Now, you could look at this two ways. One, this tells us the ideology of Athens. You should not be upset that your man's going to war. You should not be upset your son's going to die at war. This is a glorious thing. And that's what they believe. That's one way of reading that. The other way, which I must admit is how I read it, which is the first way is what you're supposed to think. And the second way is what's actually happening.
Yep.
Yeah. So you're not supposed to be upset, but you're blooming are. All right. Yeah. So highly emotive, highly distraught interaction with this departure. The man leaves. He joins the Dean group. So the men that he lives around, day to day, the men that are going with him, he joins them first. They then go to the central mustering point, wherever it is, go through another set of rituals, and then they finally get to depart. So this is not as simple as you get called up, you leave. There is a whole process you go through. And this process is important for you as an individual, but it's also important for the group dynamic of the military group for when they depart, creating that sense of unity before you've even, entered the battlefield.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I wonder, I'm guessing the whole notion of why we don't know much about the family's, I guess, involvement with this departure. Is it because it's a much more intimate setting and it goes against the narrative of, I guess, the political view of this war? Because you don't want the competing ideas of a somber, sad event, I guess, a negative connection to the war from a political view, which is, I guess, in most histories, that's what we get in the histories, isn't it? Is the political view of what's taking place. We don't get those more intimate settings of the family behind the scenes, what's actually taking place. And then obviously you going off and how you're describing how, I guess, everyone gets together before they head out and go through these same rituals and practices to make them less individualistic and more of a one unit is there. I don't know, just it sort of rings familiar with, I guess, today when you go from civilian life, and if you do go into the armed forces, you go through a transformation where you're basically taken from this one way of viewing the world into another way of how you should act, and your different, I guess, morals and ethics and whatever else are meant to be upheld. So you're almost going through this transition to prepare you to go out into the battlefield. And so I just found it interesting how it's, I guess, very similar to, I guess, today as well in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. And unless you live in a military society, kind of has connotations as does warrior society, but ultimately a society that is constantly in conflict, constantly raiding or being raided, things like that. You can't really expect an individual who spends most of his life in peace on a day-to-day basis to just go into battle. You need to prepare him in some way. Now, in the modern day, we have professional military systems that do this. Even our reservists, go through training systems. There is a process you go through to get to that. Even though you still interact with the civilian world more often as a reservist, you still go through processes of training, go through processes of preparation for the time where you might be called up. in the ancient world, in the ancient Greek world, where there's no professionalization, you haven't got the opportunity to do that. So they found another way of doing it, and that's these kind of processes that are in place. There's also things like, societal expectations and not brainwashing is kind of an oversimplification, but those kind of cultural exertions on you of you're constantly told day in, day out, that this is a good thing, this is what you want to do, to be ultimately the Athenians and the Spartans and the Argives and the Syracusans, all of them associated masculinity with warfare. So to be a man, you needed to perform in war. Yeah. So there is always this expectation. So whilst they're not professional and they don't have these other processes that help them, they have a cultural conditioning. That's the term I'm looking for. A cultural conditioning that helps prepare them. But even then, they still need a transition.
Yep.
They still need that transition to help them get through. And to be able to perform on the battlefield at the end of it. Remembering no professional system and ultimately no training. Hoplites in particular, I will constantly talk about hoplites here because it's what all our evidence focuses on. But cavalry would have been very similar, but not identical, but similar. Archers, peltasts, rowers, things like that, we just don't know. We can assume it's the same, but we just don't know. The evidence just isn't there. So if I keep talking about hoplites, I do apologize, but that's where our evidence is. Hoplites were not trained. Certainly not methodically trained in any way. They're not drilled. Which actually, when you read the battle narratives, you can start to notice, because one, they're very identical, and two, they don't do anything with any finesse. They don't do anything very technical. The only people who can do proper maneuvers, other than the Spartans, who can do one maneuver, and that's it, are mercenaries. Only mercenaries can really do what we might consider finite tactical maneuvers. The citizen militia, the citizen hoplite cannot, as a rule. So, no professionalization. So how do they prepare for war? Ultimately, it's things like this. This is these transitions. It's these buildings of unity. These unit cohesion is paramount to a phalanx's performance. And this is one of the many ways that they achieve that.
So I guess it was more heavily a psychological, transformation that they were looking to impart on them to prepare them.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we talk about the psychology of war all the time, even in modern military studies, but in the phalanx, it's all psychological. Because ultimately, if you don't run from the phalanx, you can't really lose, because the phalanx doesn't break. And if the phalanx doesn't break, no one's really dying in any large numbers. If you actually have a look at the death tolls of hoplite battles, they're very small. Very small. Yeah. And the majority of the killing occurs in the rout. So ultimately, if you've got a psychologically unified group, if you've got a strong group of people who just are intent on not running and not breaking the line, you've got I'll just make up a statistic. You've got a 99% chance of winning that battle just because you haven't run away.
Yeah. So I guess this can maybe transfer us into, the preparation for war and the psychological preparations that go into that. Now, I'm assuming there would be some sort of event taking place for a homecoming as well to integrate people back into their city state as well.
Yeah, there does seem to be, but again, no evidence at all, which in itself is revealing. So sometimes, as historians, we can become quite despondent by gaps in our evidence. But sometimes a gap on something that should be so apparent. The Greeks constantly talk about war. Coming home from war should come up a lot. Anytime an army leaves, and in my book, I've actually tracked every single time we know an army leaves Athens, how many are mustered, etc., etc. We're never told any of them come home. Not one of them. I mean, we can assume they do, obviously. Athens is remarkably successful militarily, but we're never told once that they come home. So you've got to ask the question, why aren't we told that? Why does this never appear? It might just be that it's so humdrum and so obvious that no point saying it. It might just be that they didn't deem it important information to record. But again, that's interesting. What does that tell us about it? So you can start to piece things together. So, for instance, we do know that, as odd as it sounds, I had to establish whether or not an Athenian army comes home as an army or if they come home as individuals.
Hmm.
And the reason I had to establish it is because no one had ever really thought to ask the question. And the reason no one had thought to ask the question is because it's really hard to answer. But when we look enough at the narratives we have, we do know that they do come home as a group. So that's first thing. Athenian army leaves as a group, and it does come home as a group. They don't come home as small dribs and drabs, individuals, things like that. They come home to Athens as a group. Okay, so their united identity is still in place when they land in Athens, when they land at the Piraeus, for instance. What we're now looking for, any ancient military lover or ancient Roman lover in particular, we're looking for a victory parade. That's the next thing you want, isn't it? An Athenian army has come home, defeated the Spartans in battle. Surely there's a victory parade, and we have no evidence of any of them. Mm. There's no description at all of any celebration of an army coming home, which again is weird. What does that tell us about their relationship with war? What does that tell us about their relationship with military service, about campaigns? Okay. So all of these gaps allow us to ask more questions. So we know they come home as a group. The very scant evidence there is suggests that they march into Athens as a group as well. So as they march into Athens as a group, they are led by the strategos, still, assuming he survived, and they'll be led to a temple, most likely somewhere like the Acropolis. You go up to the Temple of Athena, on the top of the Acropolis, you give your thanks there as a group, and then you are disbanded. So an Athenian army is not disbanded until it enters the city. Okay. The reason why I'm emphasizing that, for something that might sound quite obvious, is we know, for instance, that the Argives, so the army of Argos, do all of their rituals and things like that outside of the city gates of Argos. We're told that explicitly by Thucydides. They have a trench outside the city gates where they even hold their war trials. So anyone who is deemed to have been unfit in battle, anyone who is deemed as a leader to have made a grievous error, they are tried before they enter the city. So there's almost like this distinction between military and civic judiciary systems, this kind of, a military court and then a civic court at home. And also the experiences involved in that. Athens doesn't have this. That's the important point. Athens, you march in as an army, you disband in Athens itself, and then you undergo scrutiny, especially as a commander. You'll undergo scrutiny with the council and with the assembly as well. So you'll be publicly scrutinized for your behavior in the civic center, in the city itself. So there's no distinction between military and civilian action. There's no distinction between civilian and military authority. Okay. So that's what happens as an army when you're disbanded. As an individual, you're finally set free, you're loose. And then what we see is almost a process of gaining your identity back as you go home. So, for instance, I mentioned before you leave to go to war, you make oaths, you make promises to the gods. You then fulfill those promises. So that's one of the first things you've got to start to do. It may take a few weeks, but that's one of your main things. You've got to make sure that you fulfill your end of the bargain to the gods that you made agreements with. So this could be, dedications of war spoils. It could be dedications of your own armor or weaponry. It could be the dedication of a statue. If you've got enough money, you might pay for a statue or maybe an inscription to the god, giving thanks. It could literally just be money. You give them money as thanks. There's lots of different ways of doing it. But you make sure you do it and you make sure that you put your name on it. So that becomes particularly important when we talk about the war dead. But you make sure your name is on this. Okay. You return home and you go through almost the same rituals that you did when you departed, but coming home. So you go through a ritual homecoming. It's almost like a cleansing. The family cleanses you to receive you back home. Okay,
Yeah.
so you go through ritual sacrifice, you go through libations and everything. There's processes. You go to the family altar, you go to the family hearth, the spiritual and ideological center of the house, the hearth. You go through the processes there, and you're reintegrated into the family through these rituals. Okay, which on the one hand makes sense from the ritualistic perspective that the Athenians live their life. On the other hand, it's interesting, because the fact that you go through this cleansing suggests that you're in some way dirty or sullied by your military service. The Greeks have a concept. I don't know if you cover much on ancient religion in your podcast, but the Greeks have a concept called miasma.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a spiritual pollution that an individual can be tainted with.
Yep.
Hundreds of ways you can get it. It can be very insignificant. So, for instance, there's argument that the process of having sex, or shall we say self-gratification, can cause minor miasma that you need to be cleansed from. Death in the family causes miasma. You become polluted as a result, and then you need to go through a cleansing ritual that takes time. Lots of things like that. So there's hundreds of different ways you can be polluted, and some less severe, some very severe. So if you kill your brother, if you commit homicide in some way, this is a very severe form of miasma, a very severe form of pollution that you need to undergo cleansing for. The fact that you are cleansed when you come home from military service suggests that they perceive you as polluted in some way. So going back to our conversation about PTSD, going back to our conversation of we can't assume that their views on war is the same as our views on war, and their relationship with war is different to our relationship with war. This is an important insight into the Greek view of military service. It doesn't mean they find killing in war polluting. We can't make that assumption, but it does suggest they find service in some way. It's just inevitable you'll be polluted. Something about your military service is inevitable you'll be polluted, and we will cleanse you to bring you into the house. And what this also gives you is a ritualistic transition. So you can almost feel the reception of the family, feel the fact that they're welcoming you back into the house through these rituals. So you don't feel isolated, you don't feel separated from your family. The family goes through this process as an important way of reminding you that you have come home.
Yeah, almost like a reversal in some sense of the heading out to war in the first place, and reintegration. So it is interesting, and I guess trying to piece it all together too with the lack of evidence would have been quite difficult as well.
Yeah, it is very difficult, and it comes back to what you were talking about, with the intimacy of these scenes, and ultimately that's the reason why we're not told about it. These are very personal. These are very intimate. It doesn't align with the political ideology. That is true. But on the same token, we don't have, from Athens, we don't have surviving letters between people. We don't have that kind of personal one-to-one evidence that we might go and look to explore these kind of perspectives, to explore these experiences. That evidence just isn't there. So we've got to kind of piece together tiny fragments of information to see where there is correlation, where there is a continuity in some way, and try and piece it all together, really.
Yeah. Well, I guess we could probably finish up on the topic that you brought up at the start, and that was to do with the war dead. And I guess you brought up the concept of almost the leave no man behind type of view with the Athenians.
Yeah. So we've got to, there's a few things we've got to kind of contextualize here. For instance, one, the Athenians, as I said before, they're the only state that do this. Sparta don't do this. Argos don't do this. Syracuse don't do this. No one else does this. Only Athens does this. All right. The second thing, they don't bring back the bodies. Okay. They bring back the burnt remains. So they cremate the bodies on the battlefield and they bring back the cremains. Right? There's a whole morbid nasty logistical underpinning to this that if you're interested, I can send you my article. I've written about it. It's not pleasant reading.
Okay.
Actually, I've written it for a blog, so there's a free version of this. If you want to go through the morbid logistics of how you burn 1,000 bodies on a battlefield, and how much cremains that leaves, how much that weighs, how much space that takes up, how do you bring that home, that kind of thing.
Yep.
I won't go into that now. But the point being is that the Athenians cremate their war dead, and then they bring back those cremains. How much of the cremains they bring back, I've actually brought into question. I don't think they bring back all of them, but I think they bring back as much as they can.
Yep.
Okay. Because when you consider weight, when you consider the logistics, and when you also consider they're in enemy territory. So if you visualize a defeat, for instance, and you've got to burn 100 bodies, you've got to get out of there as well. So you haven't got the time to do it properly. You haven't got the time to, to take the effort to find the wood, to burn the bodies correctly, to transport it all. I mean, think of the logistics to transport what is ultimately literally dead weight through enemy territory after a defeat. I mean, this is a logistical military nightmare. So we've also got to think pragmatically as well. But ultimately they do bring them home. So they bring home the cremains. They're stored somewhere. We don't know where. Until the end of the campaigning season for that year. So Greek armies usually campaign in the summer. Late spring and summer is when they campaign. And then they usually have to come home basically for the harvests. That's fundamentally what they're coming home for. During that winter, Athens puts on a public funeral for their war dead. Okay, so they're the ones that ritually accept the bodies. They're the ones that offer all the rights to the bodies of the war dead. The state do, not the family. Mm-hmm. The families never get the remains. Okay. Now, Thucydides goes into real detail in the first year of the Peloponnesian War. He explains this funeral in fair detail. It doesn't quite tell us everything we want to know, but it's in fair detail. But he's building up to let him recount Pericles' famous funeral oration, which I'll get into in a minute. So he tells us, there's a parade of the coffins. The remains are laid out in tents, and the families can come give gifts to their dead. Considering they've been cremated, I'm going to assume, and I do assume, that the remains stay in a coffin. I don't think we should visualize, cremated bone laid out on a table or anything like that. They're in a coffin, a tribal coffin. So like I said earlier, there are 10 tribes. All the remains from people who died in that tribe get put into the same coffin.
Yep.
Okay. So you've got the 10 coffins, pretty big coffins as well. For, I think it's 3 days, 2 to 3 days. They're laid out for honors. So friends, family can come in from the outsides of Attica as far as they need to, the furthest points that they could live away from Athens. They come to the center and pay their respects. And then there is a parade of the coffins through Athens as a ritual walkway all the way to the Keramakos, so basically the cemetery of Athens, and they go to apparently Thucydides tells us the most beautiful suburb in all in Athens is called the Demosion Sema, basically the public kind of funerary area. And they're buried there with public honors, publicly funded. And the greatest individual in Athens, the greatest speaker, the greatest politician, whoever he may be, is selected to give the funeral oration, which is an important speech in which he honors the dead, and he also honors Athens generally. So he talks about the history of Athens. He talks about the mythology and the underpinning of Athenian democratic ideals. This is where Pericles, describes Athens as the kind of the learning center of all of Greece. This is a lot of political narrative, a lot of ideology on display here. And And at the end, he actually also addresses the family. The families of the war dead are specifically addressed. And he tells them, to the wives, stop crying. If you're old enough, go remarry and have more children so that they can die as well in the phalanx and be great just like their dad. If you're too old to remarry, just raise your sons correctly. If you're mothers and you're too old to have more children to replace your own child, don't worry because you've done your job. If you're a brother or a son, you now have an aspiration to live up to, emulate them. Yeah. So big political ideology, big social conditioning moment at this funeral oration that the entire of Athens goes to. Everyone goes to this event. Everyone's listening. Okay. So you've got this big funeral being put on. There's also funeral games that are put on. It's quite a big event. It's an important event to the Athenians. And it also highlights something about this experience because the funeral oration and this entire process actually keeps the war dead as a united group. So, we talked about when they're departing for war, they become a united group and they get rituals done on their behalf. They're no longer an individual. They become de-individuated is the kind of sociological term. For the war dead, this always stays the same. So the war dead become a collective group. This is apparent in the speech, constantly talking about the war dead. Pericles' speech even goes as far as to say that their individual identities when they're alive have been undone, or any error they made, any sort of bad character traits they had no longer exist because they are part of the war dead. So there's this real sense of your individual identity has been subsumed into a group identity, which is an important group identity, the war dead. Okay. This is not only seen in the speech, this is seen in another area of commemoration for the dead, which is in the casualty lists. So alongside this public funeral, the Athenian state erects monuments to the war dead. So they erect big lists of the campaign of a particular year or various campaigns in a particular year, and they list the names of everyone who died. If this sounds familiar, this is because this is the exact model that after World War I, most states, most countries who took part in the war emulated this model of commemoration. Okay. In Athens, they have the list of the names. They're listed by tribe. So again, you're associated with a tribe. But it's only your first name. So there's no what we call a patronym. There's no father's name. So in ancient Greece, you don't have a surname. You have your father's name as kind of an identifier. So, it's Bob, son of John, kind of thing. Without that identifier, you basically don't exist anymore. You're just a name. So it would be the same as going to a war memorial now, seeing the list of the dead and seeing just, John, Stephen, Brian. And you're like, well, which one? Who? These are just random names. They have the identity of the family, the identity of their own personal identity is kept from them. Their identity is associated with the tribe. Their identity is associated with the state. Okay. So that's how the funeral is done. That's how the state commemorate the war dead. And I don't want this to sound negative. This is a great honor to the Athenians. This is an honor that, in particular, a poor man, he wouldn't be given the great honor of a cremation, which is a very expensive thing to do. He wouldn't be given this kind of public funeral or even close to this kind of level of mourning. So it's a real honor to him to be given this. So it's something that they would have appreciated and would have respected in their own right. I don't want it to sound, completely negative, but we do need to understand the kind of experience or the impact this might have on the families afterwards.
Yeah, it's listening to that too. For me, it almost seeing how the soldier comes back as a group still almost highlights the importance of the homecoming for those still alive, because the dead can't physically go through that process,
Yeah.
and they're stuck in, I guess they're stuck as part of that unit still.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it seems to
absolutely.
really,
No,
it
no,
just
yeah.
seems to really highlight the importance of that
Spot on.
homecoming
Go
for
on, sorry.
those. Sorry, I was just saying it really does seem to highlight the importance of that homecoming for those that are still alive, and how much that means to reintegrating them back into society.
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, this is what exploring the transitional war dead, why that was so important for the project, because they don't get to go through that transition home. So what you see is actually how the state perceives the military unit until it's disbanded, because the war dead don't get disbanded. So you see there's still that sense of ownership. There's still that sense of, well, they're ours. They're not the families. So yeah, it's important. It is vital to understand. The other thing about this funeral, the one thing I didn't mention, is because of how important it was to the people that the dead come home. And this is something we can, in the modern day, really relate to. It's important for the bodies to be repatriated. I don't know how it is in Australia, but I know in Britain this is a big issue. You know, we still have the kind of images of the coffins of our war dead coming off the planes, paraded through some of our towns. The towns come out to witness the parade. It's an important event here. And that is true in Athens. But what there also is in Athens is an acknowledgement that that's not always possible. So, for instance, if you die on land, fair enough, you can be cremated, you could probably come home. If you die at sea, that becomes awfully hard, because retrieving the body becomes harder. Dealing with the bodies quickly becomes harder. There's greater logistical obstacles to bringing them home. So there is a general acknowledgement that if you died in a sea battle, there's a good chance your body's not coming home. So with a city-state, with a culture that promises the homecoming of the dead, they have to deal with this in some way. They have to acknowledge it, they have to accept it, and they have to deal with it in some way. So what they resolved to do was, in the parade of the coffins that I mentioned, in this parade of the 10 coffins being buried, there is an 11th item, and it's an empty funeral bed that is also paraded. And it's completely made up like a funeral bed, but it is empty, and it's paraded all the way to the cemetery. We're not sure if it's buried as well. We're not told. I kind of like to think it might have been, but I have no evidence for that whatsoever. And the empty funeral bed is a symbolic gesture for those who could not be brought home. So they are offered their funeral through this bed. Yeah. So they're not offered a coffin, because they should be in one of the other coffins. They're offered the actual funeral bed. This is the funeral bed you would have had. So what you have is almost a symbolically ritualistic funeral for those who could not come home. And this... Oh, go on, sorry.
I was going to say, it sounds like a very similar concept to the whole unknown soldier that comes home in Australia and in Britain, that seems to represent all those soldiers that couldn't make it back, because you don't know who was exhumed and actually brought home.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It is exactly that. I have no doubt in my mind that the burial of the unknown warrior or the unknown soldiers in the various countries is a direct emulation of this Athenian practice. Because the other thing is, in the UK, we have this idea that the unknown warrior suggestion came from Reverend Rowton. The truth of that is a bit debated, but if we assume it is true, he himself was, he loved the classics. He was very good at Greek, very good at Latin. He would have read Thucydides. He will have read Pericles' oration. He will have read that funeral description. There's no question. So he would have seen this. So it's interesting, could it be that that's one of the influences or otherwise? The other thing is, there was another way of acknowledging the dead who didn't come home, or the dead whose bodies you couldn't have. you could, as a family, you could set up an empty grave. So you create a grave monument where there's no body. So, if they've died abroad, if they've died, on a holiday or elsewhere in exile or whatever it be, you set up an empty tomb, an empty grave really, for that person. And the word for that in Greek is kenotaphion, literally empty grave. And kenotaphion, put into Latin and then into English, gives us our word cenotaph. So when you go to the cenotaphs there's loads of them in England. What you're looking at is a continuation of that Greek practice. The empty grave, along with the unknown warrior, are two ritualistic, symbolic acknowledgements that not everyone comes home, but they still deserve their rights.
Yes. It's interesting to see all the, like you said, it's probably down to a lot of people creating these traditions that are looking back to classical Greece and transferring that into our modern times as well. Because you see the same thing with, like you said, the names on the wall, although we don't de-individualize people so much.
Yeah.
But we have war cemeteries as well, where all the soldiers actually buried together as a unit. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, we do. I mean, we have our military cemeteries, also our areas and individual graves. It is definitely interesting. I mean, it doesn't really come as a great surprise that, especially in the First World War, after the First World War, sovereign states that are cementing their democratic ideals and ideologies more and more look to the oldest democracy for answers.
Yep. Absolutely.
And I mean, the First World War, one of the biggest problems of the First World War was, of course, the number of citizens dying. And in a democracy, that becomes a more challenging thing. You need to offer the people something. Because ultimately they do wield some power. So you need to offer them something. So there is a democratic link here, as well as sort of a classics political elite looking for inspiration as well.
Now, if you've got a few more minutes to spare,
always.
One thing that has popped in my mind is this about the returning of the war dead. Now, is it that they're brought to Athens, or is that the important part, Athens itself, or is Attica the region also? All I'm thinking of is the exception of Marathon. I know it falls just outside of the classical age, but is there like a transition that takes place, or is this still fundamentally the same sort of homecoming for the dead?
Marathon is not a homecoming at all. Marathon is a hangover of old practices. So I mentioned Athens is the only one that repatriates their war dead.
Yep.
Everyone else, or in the nearest friendly territory. And that's ultimately what the Athenians do at Marathon. They bury them on the field. And that's a standard archaic and classical period practice for every other Greek army.
Yep.
Athens makes this shift as it goes democratic. So if you think actually the kind of reforms it undergoes at the end of the sort of 500s, the implementation of the radical democracy, and the Marathon occurs. It's not many decades between those two events. So it's still kind of finding its way, shall we say. So it definitely does undergo a transition. It undergoes a big shift in its relationship with warfare and its relationship with the dead. So this repatriation that we only find in the 5th century. It doesn't happen in archaic Greece at all.
Yep.
All right. So there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the democratic ideology. Two, the logistical costs. So Athens can only do this because it's very wealthy because of its empire. This costs a lot of money. Where are they getting their money from? They're getting it from the exploitation of their empire. Okay. So that's one important thing. The other important thing is there's a shift in the 5th century between men who decide they want to go to war, and in democracy, men being told they're going to war. So if we think of archaic warfare as a lot of sort of, it's kind of dismissive to talk them as war bands, but it's much more of an elite thing. So, you need the money to be able to go to war. There's not the great civic expectation that you're going to go to war just because you're there. When Athens transfers into this democratic system, when citizenship requires military service, all of a sudden, everyone's required to go to war. Armies become bigger, and they implement this katalogos system that I described. This is now an enlistment system. So you're told to go. You're no longer deciding whether or not you want to because you haven't got a choice. So their very relationship with military service has changed. Okay. And perhaps this is why we see little shifts in the evidence. So, for instance, I mentioned departure scenes. We'll go back to departure scenes to kind of end this. In the archaic period, so basically before Marathon, Athenian departure scenes are full of loads of individuals. There's like horses and dogs. They're very busy scenes. And the rituals involved are almost always horoscopy. So it's the reading of the signs. It's the omen reading. There are lots of omen readings. As soon as you move from 6th century into the 5th century, we no longer see omen readings. We only really see libations. Now, the way I kind of interpret the shift, because it times in with this different relationship with military service and enlistment, is you go from an omen reading being depicted, which is, should I go? Should I not go? Is this a good idea? Yes or no, which suggests I have choice, to a libation, which is, will the gods please look after me? Why are you asking the gods to look after you? Because you actually haven't got a choice.
Yep.
So you've lost that element of choice. You've lost that agency as an individual. And then when you start to look at all these transitions, you realize that that is a common thread throughout every single one of them. The individual has agency. He has the ability to act on his own. And then as he joins the military system, he loses that right. And this is reflected in the religious rights. It's reflected in the commemorative rights. It's reflected throughout his military service as well. And that must have an impact on the way he perceives his actions and his interactions in war, and then when he returns home.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've spent a fair bit of time, haven't we, talking?
It's almost 2 hours. I'm sorry, Mark.
Yeah, no, that's I don't want to take up all your morning. So
you're saving me from a meeting. Don't worry.
But I greatly appreciate you coming on to talk to us today about your latest work, Military Departures, Homecomings, and Death in Classical Athens, and sharing, I guess, your research into that book.
No, thank you so much for having me on. It's great to have outlets like this that are willing to listen to me ramble on about my research.
No, it's a great help, and I think it'll be interesting to a lot of people hearing these topics that just don't really come up in a lot of books that we would be exposed to in the more general sort of readership. Now, if people wanted to come across your work, where would be the best places for them to search for you?
Well, I'm easiest found on sort of social media, sort of Twitter, under my name. Also run the Bad Ancient website, badancient.com. Again, social media outlets, pretty much on most of them, except TikTok. I'm too old for TikTok. I haven't worked it out. That's the best place for me. I mean, a lot of my work is behind paywalls and expensive books and things, but I write lots of blogs, and all of that's talked about on my Twitter feed and elsewhere as well. I do try and make as much of this available as possible.
Yep, and I'll be sure to put up all your links on the episode page too, so people can find their way to you as well. But once again, Owen, thanks for coming on and talking with us.
No, thanks so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed the interview with Dr Owen Rees. I had been meaning to ask Dr Rees onto the show for some time, after I was aware of his work in the popular history books I mentioned in the episode, along with his work through the site of Bad Ancient. Though, once I became aware of his latest work, I wasted no time in reaching out. I feel this topic provided an excellent subject to talk about, as it is not spoken of much in the more accessible parts of historical writing. So I hope everyone was able to take away some excellent insights that Dr Rees was able to provide. I found the discussion we had very interesting around the main subjects we looked at, particularly the concept of PTSD in the ancient world, and the question around whether it was the same thing as today, as well as if the same experiences caused the same trauma. I also found how the war dead of Athens was treated quite fascinating, along with the realisation that it seems very likely a number of the concepts the Athenians used to remember their dead being resurrected in more modern times. If you enjoyed our talk today, I would highly recommend looking further into Dr Owen Rees' work. As he did mention, his latest book is a scholarly work and priced as such, but if you find it fits into your budget, I would highly recommend it, as it fleshes out many of the topics we covered today. Otherwise, I would also recommend checking out two of his popular history works, Great Battles of the Classical Greek World and Great Naval Battles of the Ancient Greek World. Both of these I had purchased before beginning the podcast series. They both provide a very good introductory account of many of the battles that occurred throughout the late Archaic period and into the classical age of Greece. I would also recommend checking out Dr Rees' website, badancient.com, where many claims about the ancient world are investigated and the veracity of the claims tested. On the episode page over at castingthroughancientgreece.com and on the show notes at your preferred podcast platform, I've also provided links to the various books and projects Dr Owen Rees has written or been involved in. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and have been supporting it on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution is truly helping me grow the series. If you have also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over at the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. Next episode, we'll be returning to the narrative of the series, where we are moving through the 50-year period between the Greco-Persian War and the Peloponnesian War. We have been currently following the first 10 years of events in the Aegean, and now we'll be heading back to the Greek mainland to see how the policies that would dictate future events were unfolding in both Sparta and Athens. I hope you can join me next time when we continue the narrative in the series with episode 55, Evolving Policies.